everybody. Welcome to the Convocation Unscripted, a podcast at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. I'm your host, Robbie Jones, and I'm joined today by Diana Butler Bass
Hi, Robbie.
and Kristen Dumay,
Hey, Robbie.
and a new face here, and Angela Denker.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we do not have Jamar Tisby with us today, but we still have four people around the mic and looking forward to the conversation. So, just as a reminder, the way this works is that somebody introduces a topic, in this case, a guest, and no one else knows what we're going to talk about. So, we're just going to give you our honest, authentic responses in the moment. That's why it's called the Convocation Unscripted. So, Kristen, let me turn it over to you. Maybe you can introduce our guest today.
Sure. So I'm so excited, Angela, that you're here with us. And man, how to introduce you? We go back several years. I think you first reached out to me before the publication of Jesus and John Wayne and before the publication of your book, Red State Christians. I think we'd kind of seen each other on social media just a little bit and realized that we were really examining the same sorts of issues, but from slightly different perspectives. So I'm a historian. You are a Lutheran pastor, and for part of your career, worked as a sports columnist, right, or sports writer, and more
hmm
recently as a columnist for the Minneapolis Star Tribune. And so you kind of bring this interest in sports and the pastoral voice and an interest in religion and politics. So why don't you tell us just a little bit about that journey and how you kind of ended up from, sports and pastorate to doing what you do now?
Yeah, so I always tell the story of that in 2009, I covered the Super Bowl, and I had the fortune of just a really fun sports career where I got to cover the Final Four, the Super Bowl, Major League Baseball. Yeah, I was a hockey beat reporter, and of interest to this group, I always say that I experienced much less misogyny in the hockey locker room than I did in the church. So it was good preparation, I suppose. Uh, but I was on the bus, so there's media buses, right? And we were coming back from covering the Super Bowl, and it had been an exciting game, Cardinals versus Steelers. And I remember even in that moment coming back from the Super Bowl on that bus, I was thinking about my discernment journey about becoming a pastor and about going to seminary. At that time, I had already been accepted, and I was taking a year to sort of prepare my life, thinking about, I come from an interesting family background in which my grandpa was a pastor and his grandpa was a pastor. He came over from Germany. And it skips a generation because the kids, it seemingly are like, heck no. Um, so I knew, and my grandpa had a really tough time with the church. So I knew the weight of ministry and I knew how consuming it would be for me. And so I took a lot of time to think about it. But ultimately, when I was doing sports writing, I often came across stories of faith in athletics. And I felt like I was having to do those stories with one hand tied behind my back as a strictly secular journalist. I had this desire to tell a greater truth, and I just sort of could never help it. So ultimately, that was what led me into seminary. At the time, I didn't know if I would actually pastor churches. I always had this sense that I wanted to do more public ministry, but I thought I might learn Arabic. I thought I might go work in the Middle East. Instead, I have served primarily, white churches in California, in Las Vegas, in Chicago, and now in Minneapolis. And fortunately or unfortunately, this long interest that I've had in watching the rise of fascist movements throughout history as a kid, I read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich as like a fourth grader and was always very interested in these stories of resistance. And as much as I know all you can relate to, you want to move into something maybe less political or less intense, and the stories find you, and it seems to be this calling, and certainly that's the way I feel this week in Minneapolis, particularly.
Yeah. So we'll get to the present moment very soon here. I just did want to give a shout out. So you wrote the book Red State Christians. Was that in 2019 or? Is that right?
Yes,
2019?
yes. And then we did a new version 2022 with just some updated content from George Floyd, the insurrection, and COVID.
And then your second book, Disciples of White Jesus, right? Do you want to give a brief synopsis of that?
Yeah. So, building on the work that you did, Kristen, in Jesus and John Wayne, I wanted to look at the role of violent masculinity, but specifically also through the lens of how this indoctrination and radicalization is happening among young boys and men. So the book starts in South Carolina with retracing the story of the massacre at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. The white supremacist shooter in that case was a member of an ELCA Lutheran church. And so part of my work, I think, is investigating and helping people to see that white nationalism and radicalization does not only exist in spaces that people think are alien to them. It exists in places like liberal communities, progressive churches. It exists among all of us. And so I'm constantly reminding people in my work to take the log out of our own eye before we remove the speck from someone else's. So throughout that book, there's investigations of theology, of rural people, of racism, certainly. And ultimately, I always find myself ending in a place of hope. So that's where it ends up.
And now you find yourself in Minneapolis at kind of ground zero, at least this month, for political violence. And can you tell us just a little bit what that's like for you? What are you seeing? Because I know, I mean, one of the reasons, and I confess, I just reached out to you this afternoon, I think, to say, hey, can you come on? Because one of the things I think that we're all struggling with is watching from a distance. We're seeing the clips on social media where I'm seeing friends who live in Minnesota post these urgent messages on their Facebook feeds, but we can just turn it off, right? We can just go about our daily lives, and it's this strange kind of disconnect where that's happening to our country, in our country, to our fellow citizens. And yet, so many Americans are just going about their daily lives, including even those of us who care deeply, because there's a sense of what can we do, a sense of this distance. So, one of the reasons, the main reason you're here is to bring that to all of us, to all of our listeners. Let us know what's happening in your home and what you're seeing with your own eyes, and who's doing what on the ground.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's really important to me that these stories from Minnesota get out. And, you know, I live in Minneapolis. The killing of Renee Good happened in Minneapolis. But as we're seeing today, the ICE agents are continuing to move out further into the outer suburbs, into rural Minnesota. And so the main message that I really want to convey is I relate to what you're saying, Kristen, because I was speaking to a group of mostly Lutheran pastors this afternoon in a Twin Cities suburb and talking about what we're all seeing in our congregations. And one pastor brought up this idea that a lot of us want to distance ourselves from what's happening. And I think when I answered his question, I said, I think that that is a tool of whiteness and white supremacy. It's this desire to intellectualize what's happening and to distance ourselves from it. And so I certainly see that in the responses to Renee Good's killing from conservatives to say, well, if only she did this, if only she did that. And those of us who've been following police violence against Black Americans for a long time, that line of thinking is very familiar. But I see it also in progressive circles. I went to my neighborhood meeting last night. We had a neighborhood meeting with our council person to talk about the response or lack thereof of local government to help neighbors feel safe. And we had neighbors there in our neighborhood, from who come from immigrant families who were openly weeping about their fear for their children, for their spouses, for just walking around the park. We have a neighborhood park right across the street where my kids play unsupervised all the time. I have never felt, unsafe in this neighborhood. And an Asian American man from our neighborhood told a story about yesterday morning at 6 a.m. he was out doing his normal walk. It's dark at that time, and he had a person come up to him. He didn't clock because it was dark that it was an ICE agent, and they said, "Hey, come with me." He thought it was just a person. He starts to get anxious, nervous. He starts running. He ends up getting tackled by two other ICE agents. So he's got three guys on him. They're yelling at him, screaming at him. Why did you run? You're resisting. Show us your ID. Now it's 6 a.m. He's out for his usual walk in the neighborhood, but he did have his driver's license on him, which was fortunate, I suppose, for him. I mean, Kristi Noem was on CNN today saying that everybody in Minnesota needs to be prepared to carry identification, which sounds like a police state to me. But as he showed them his driver's license, thankfully he was allowed to walk away. But I noticed with this incident and with an incident just a couple blocks away at a private Catholic school where ICE was chasing somebody, the car crashed into the parking lot in this Catholic school. The schools went onto lockdown. Our preschool across the street went into lockdown. Both of these incidents are happening in a neighborhood of Minneapolis that is overwhelmingly white. We're very close to the border of an affluent suburb, Edina. And I notice that my neighbors are much more comfortable talking about giving charity, talking about donating money, food, than reckoning with the fact that these incidents are happening in our neighborhood. So what I want everybody to understand, and what I think it's really important to make a distinction about, is that our response as Americans who do not want to live in a police state needs to be one of solidarity and not of charity. You know, we need to understand ourselves all as potential victims of this ICE assault and not be thinking, well, we just need to only help immigrants. We need to stand in solidarity and not in charity. And I think that that is the only way we're going to beat back this assault.
Yeah, it's making me think about the license thing. I mean, because we've also heard ICE agents saying, and by the way, a driver's license is not an immigration document, right? And even several cases where they wouldn't accept that as any kind of proof of citizenship, or, and continue to detain people. But I wonder if, before we get too far in, if you could just talk a little bit about um, what's going on, like, why Minneapolis, and what's the pretense that's being given for Minneapolis, and also what do you think's really going on in terms of like why Minneapolis is being targeted the way it is. I mean, I was just reading today that the presence of ICE officers and Customs and Border Patrol officers now are 5 times the amount of local law enforcement officers. Like, that's the kind of federal invasion and provocation that we're talking about. We're not talking about just a few roving bands of kind of rogue people here and there. I mean, we're talking about, I mean, you can only use the word invasion, kind of federal invasion over and above. That's just overwhelming local law enforcement. But I was thinking particularly about the Somali population there, and that Trump's explicitly, used that as a pretense, and maybe a little bit about how Lutherans have actually been involved in settling the Somali, population that's actually there with the government's help, by the way.
Yeah, and we're talking about this assault involving unmarked vehicles and men wearing masks. And I think the unmarked vehicles thing is a really big deal because it's created an environment of fear and suspicion. I had a neighbor today who went to a restaurant and he was mistaken for ICE. And so he's getting, people giving him the finger, and people taking photos of him because everybody is on edge and we don't know who is ICE and who isn't necessarily. So any large black or white SUV is potentially suspicious vehicle. People are trying to keep license plate databases going. But that only adds to the environment of fear and uncertainty. And also, incidentally, they're using rental vehicles. So you can't get a rental car in the Twin Cities right now because they've all been rented out by, I mean, specifically a larger SUV. They've all been rented out by ICE. They've also started to have minivans. So the sheer numbers, as Robbie points out, are absolutely overwhelming. The Somali population here, I noticed something this morning. I had an allergy shot. So I went to the normal clinic just outside the city of Minneapolis in a nearby suburb. And typically when I go to this clinic, I see a lot of Somali people. I see a lot of women wearing headscarves. I see a lot of East African people. This morning when I went there, I did not see a single non-white person. People are disappearing into their homes. And the Somali population in Minnesota has certainly been victims of racism here. We are not immune as a state, certainly, to a long and ugly history of racism. And incidentally, I should also mention there are still four people who are part of the Oglala Sioux community
Yeah.
that have been abducted by ICE. I mean, if you want any proof that this is not about immigration, that are still unaccounted for, and the tribe cannot ascertain their whereabouts. But the Somali population here, one of the good things about the Lutheran Church that I'm a part of, the ELCA, is we do have a history of strong support of refugee resettlement and strong integration with the Somali community. There's a Lutheran college here in town that both of my parents went to, even my Catholic dad, Augsburg College, now Augsburg University. They were one of the first Lutheran colleges to employ a Muslim chaplain as part of their campus ministry staff because of their belief in interfaith work, because of their belief in supporting and serving the Somali community. And the Somali community is absolutely under siege. And I should also point out that this pretext of fraud, the lead prosecutor, Thompson, the U.S. Attorney for Minnesota, who's been leading this fraud case, resigned in protest along with his top staff yesterday rather than do an investigation of Renee Good's wife. So you're actively undermining those who are actually rooting out and investigating this fraud. And here in Minnesota, I've been reading about these fraud cases, specifically Feeding Our Future, which was led by a white woman, not by a Somali person. We've been reading about this for over a year. Some of these cases were already prosecuted in federal court, and the people who were involved have been held accountable. So this is nothing new, but what's new is right-wing influencers creating a ludicrous story about Somali-owned daycares. And as a result of this ICE activity, undermining those who were doing the fraud investigation who can actually root out this fraud.
The Somali population, is my understanding, when the large number of them came some 30 or so years ago, came under the auspices of the Clinton administration and were supported by Lutheran World Services. And is that correct?
I think, yeah, Lutheran Social Services, Lutheran
Lutheran
Immigration
Social
and Refugee.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we've changed names now to a more innocuous sounding name, but it used to be LIRS.
Okay. And so there's always been close ties between the Lutheran community in Minnesota and the Somali uh, community as well. So that's true.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And it's I see, the inside of it, and I see the ways in which we always need to do better, and the ways in which, as I kind of mentioned before, a lot of our work has been too much rooted in charity and not solidarity. But what I am seeing in Minneapolis now truly is solidarity. Last Wednesday after the killing of Renee Good, last Thursday, we had a clergy press conference at the site. And I was pretty much crying the entire time. But as I walked up, what you saw immediately when you got to that scene is a large group of Somali people creating a barrier to protect the clergy and also serving us sambusas and traditional Somali food. There is a real sense of partnership. And I will say that is something that I cherish and love about the faith community here in Minneapolis is over the years, there's been really hard work done to build relationships, to build partnerships that are authentic, that are really rooted in solidarity and work together. And at that clergy press conference, as at the vigils held after the Annunciation school shooting, we have imams there, we have rabbis there, and we have Lutheran pastors there, and Catholic clergy there as well. And that's a beautiful thing that I want to preserve about Minneapolis.
No,
I lived in St. Paul for a year because I taught at McAllister College as a visiting
Oh, yeah.
professor. Yeah, it was a long time ago. But one of the things that really struck me was the reputation of Minneapolis and St. Paul as it being a very white place. Um, but there was this other part of it that was really obvious, and that was all these different interesting refugee communities. So I had never been around Somali refugees before, but there they were in Target and the local grocery store, and just sort of integrating themselves into the community in some really interesting ways. But the other population were the Hmong refugees.
Hmm.
And that is a story that's taken a little, I think, slower track into the national consciousness. But yesterday I saw a piece about a woman who ICE came to her front door and said, "Are you such and such a family?" And she said, "No, they don't live here anymore," but she didn't give any information about where they did live. And just so happened that she knew that that was a Hmong family. Those are people from Southeast Asia who mostly resettled in the States after the Vietnam War. And so I guess they were further down the street or whatever. And the ICE agent got very upset at her because she wouldn't tell them where this Hmong family lived. And finally, he thought, well, maybe they just don't understand. So he said, well, where are the Asians? And whoa, I mean,
Yeah.
that is this other level of what's going on, because we think immediately of sort of black and white, Christian and Muslim. We think about people who have darker hued skin in terms of Asia, Latin America, South Americans as refugees, but we forget oftentimes about the large Asian American populations that are in American cities everywhere. And my understanding is they're increasingly frightened. And I think that what's happening in Minneapolis is certainly good reason. It's giving evidence to show that these well-established refugee populations brought by our own government decades ago, under circumstances that were deeply humanitarian, often that we caused by our own international policies, going in and sort of scooping up people to save in wake of failures on our part overseas. And yet now they're some of the very people being targeted by this.
I was going to say, I just think it's worth hammering that point home. That's why it's been heartbreaking to me to like think about that story. So in the 1990s, you're right, it was under Clinton. Uh, Somali refugees were resettled because there was a devastating civil war there, right? And a great humanitarian crisis, hunger, healthcare, all of the social systems fell apart. And so the US, in a kind of humanitarian project, brings them here, helps them get resettled, partners with faith groups, right? Like Lutheran Social Services to resettle these places. Now, that's the America I want to live in,
Right.
right? That does that kind of work, right? And so here we are, and and they've been here now for 3 decades, right? Only to find themselves on the other end of a gun at the sort of instigation of the very government that said you can come here and be safe. Like this is just heartbreaking to me when you think about like that's the country we've turned into. The
Yes.
one that people were running from is now the country we are.
And deeply entrenched, as Diana says, communities and communities that intersect all of our lives all the time. I'm thinking of one of my son's best friend's mothers who comes from a Hmong family and has also kind of gone into hiding over the last few days. And I do think that too often we erase the stories of Asian immigrants. And we don't want to do that here because that is a population that is terrified, that is being targeted. And just as much as each of these groups, they've contributed to the fabric of the Twin Cities. I mean, in a very trite and silly way, I'll say, I grew up in the Twin Cities. I couldn't get away fast enough out of high school. I went and lived a bunch of other places. And when it was time, after I'd had my second son, we were living in Southern California, and I just couldn't stay away anymore. I wanted to come back. My parents are here. I wanted to raise my kids in Minneapolis. And when I came back, one of the biggest changes I noticed is the food scene, like
Yes.
directly because of our immigrant communities, the Minneapolis food scene was no longer like ketchup and salt as our only spices. Lutheran Lutherans are not known for our great food. I'm more of a, sausage Lutheran than I'm a lutefisk Lutheran. But nonetheless, this is part of the fabric of our community, and it is, as Robbie says, heartbreaking. And also this notion, my mom was telling me a story yesterday about that she was talking to someone who was from Denmark and told her that her friends had said, "Why are you going to America? It's not a safe place to go. You need to come back to Denmark."
Yeah. I want to underscore a couple of things that you said, Angela, because I think it needs to be reiterated. And the first is that the story of the Somali daycare scandal, corruption, and all of that, right? This was reported. It, like you said, it's been in the news for more than a year. It's been prosecuted, right? This is not like some discovery. But if you look at the right-wing propaganda machine, right, you would never know that. And I'm going to expand that right-wing propaganda machine to include a lot of people who ought to know better, and in fact do know better, right? So I'm seeing that lie being repeated throughout Christian evangelical spaces, right? Just pure propaganda, evil propaganda. And so, set the record straight there because I think a lot of people are not aware of that because those voices spewing the lies are just so loud. And then the other thing, which we've been talking about is this is not just targeting Somalis, right? Just like, a couple years back, the Haitians and JD Vance and all of that, right? Like they can choose their specific target, but the point is never really to go after those people, right? They're after something bigger. And how absurd is it that they are going after Native Americans, right? What does that mean? And I think back to, I mean, all of us on this call have for years been trying to warn about the racism and white nationalism at the heart of these movements, right? At the heart of the religious right? We see it, the evidence is right in front of us. And instead of dealing with that white nationalism, so many quote unquote moderates, right? Conservatives attacked the messengers, right? Went after those of us who were trying to raise the alarm and did not deal with the hate, the cruelty, the overt racism in their own midst. And I just want to read one tweet here put out by a Christian nationalist, Theo Bro, yesterday. "I honestly do not care how bad it looks, how loud they scream, how much they cry, how many arrests it takes, how much money it costs. How many foolish American citizens who interfere with ICE suffer the consequences of their reckless actions. I just want my country back." That is what we're dealing with.
So I think the "I don't care"
Yeah.
part in that is like
Yeah.
really important, right? So for a Christian to say, "I don't care how much they cry, I don't care how much pain it causes." I mean, you've left the faith, man, if that's what you say. Like, you can't say you're Christian and say that, right? I mean, it really is, and it reminds me of this broader thing that we're going to have to fight, I think, even more, this broader outright attack on empathy inside of evangelical circles,
That's right.
right? That empathy is dangerous, right? That's the argument because it gets in the way of obeying God's truth. Now, once again, like for a Christian to kind of work your, gymnastically work your way into that space, boy, you have done a lot of work to get there from the gospel. But I mean, it's really quite remarkable to think that, oh no, actually empathizing, and it's a hardness, right? It's a sort of hardening of the, I mean, to use biblical language, it's like
Yeah.
the hardening of the heart, like, but celebrating the hardening of the heart, right, as something that's Christian, and it's just evil.
Well, and let's talk about how these folks have been primed for years to accept this kind of violence and cruelty. mothers and fathers have been taught to parent their children with this kind of cruelty, to not be swayed by crying, to not be swayed by suffering, to beat it out of your children. And I think that that is a really important aspect of this. And I also think, can we talk about the misogyny at the heart of all of this? The killing of Renee Good, as you read that tweet, Kristen, it sent chills up my spine because that was how so many of us felt when we witnessed the reaction to her death, was this resounding reminder for many of us that people in our lives would react with much the same lack of care to our own death because she was simply disposable, because she simply was behaving in a way that not performing the appropriate acquiescence, submission as a woman to this movement. It was just palpable to feel. And this teaching has been going on for a very, very long time to create adults now who have a very cruel, hardened approach to the world and sadly to themselves. This movement is going to destroy so many people who've participated in it. I just finished listening to the book, Some People Need Killing, the account of what happened in the Philippines under Rodrigo Duterte and the murders. And the end of the book talks about the people who had supported Duterte and had watched it all fall apart. And they talked about creating all these online personas and attacking people who they cared about, and then finding out slowly, piece by piece, that they were wrong, and going back and noticing, oh, I was blocked by this person. Oh, I ruined these relationships. And there's just a carnage. I mean, I keep thinking about that Arnold Schwarzenegger video where he talks about the men beating their wives and children after the fall of the Nazi regime, and hearing that carnage in all of his neighbors' homes. We're going to see mental health issues. We're going to see suicides. We're going to see addiction. We're hearing stories in Minneapolis of ICE agents frequenting all the liquor stores, buying up all kinds of alcohol. It is going to be an unrelenting carnage.
One of the things that was disturbing to me about the misogyny was that it got linked very particularly with homophobia in this case, because there still is in that long echo from the South and the period of the worst enslavement in American history, that idea that keeping Black people in chains was somehow protecting white womanhood. And so there have been, I don't know how well substantiated, but multiply reported stories that inside the White House, there was some degree of anxiety that this particular ICE agent killed a white woman. It was like, that was not supposed to happen. Kill lots of other people, but that's a bad way to go. And then they discovered that she was a lesbian. And that became a really important part of the online story. And one of the things that you can't help but notice is in many of the videos since, the videos of people, the ICE agents pulling over regular people and saying, show me your papers, blah, 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 blah. And the person resisting, the ICE agent would say, have you learned nothing in the last few days? Did you learn nothing about that killing of that lesbian B word? And that to me is another picture of how you other. You go for the one thing that you think can separate the murdered person, the person who should be the receiver of sympathy and empathy. You pick the one thing that makes them different. And so then they go into a different bucket. Oh, oh yeah, so she was a white woman, but she's not the right kind of white woman. And so what's happening, I think, in this whole horrifying episode in Minneapolis, I think this is a test run, obviously, for a larger scale things that are going to go on across the United States. And I also think it's really important. It's happening at the beginning of an election year, for multiple reasons. But if the bucket is being, the size of it is getting bigger. And that means more and more populations are going to go into that bucket as potential targets for both ICE and also social scorn. And so it, this is ethnic cleansing.
And I think we should, make very clear that anyone by virtue of resisting in any way is not the right kind of person and has no right to exist if we extend that out, right? I think we need to be very clear about that. That is how this game is played, and history has many examples of where this leads.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Trump's memo, right, where he tries to redefine domestic terrorists.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think history will go back and look at that memo and say that's where that's a beginning point of a whole trajectory of domestic, a new understanding of domestic terrorism, because it includes things like, by the way, all four of us on this call right now are domestic terrorists by that definition.
Yes.
Right? Because it includes things holding extremist views about traditional family structures and religion, for example, are in that memo as part of a definition of like who is now a threat to that vision of America. So yeah, I'm really, really I think you're right, Kristen, that we're going to be very clear about this. This is not a game; it's a warm up for where we're headed.
Yeah. And the pinning it with the election year, I think, is really significant because one, you're scaring people, you're showing this, big movement of force in the streets of a city. So you're keeping people potentially from a voting booth. The other thing I just keep thinking about is how much the upper Midwest was 20 years ago, a sort of a test run area for the shifting of state houses to the GOP and gerrymandering, all of those states, particularly Wisconsin and Michigan, but some in Minnesota too. So you would get these large votes for Democrats, but Democrats couldn't get enough seats in local governments in order to have any say or any real power in the way that the state was moving. And part of that came out of Scott Walker in Wisconsin coming up with this idea of failed cities.
Yeah.
So if a city failed, in terms of how whatever that was defined as economically or in terms of its leadership, the state government run by Republicans could come in and take over a failed city. And it was that failed city plan that did really create the conditions for the redistricting of the upper Midwest as almost completely Republican. So it made it very difficult for Democrats to win. And it seems pretty darn obvious that that Trump and Vance and now the Department of Justice is using the language for Minnesota of being a failed state. It just took me immediately back 2 decades to Scott Walker. And I thought, well, does that mean then that not only the feds come in and fill your streets with armed men, but have they come up with some sort of plan, legal rationale, whatever, for the federal government to come in and actually take over state offices like the governor or the attorney general or
The Secretary of State to count votes.
the Secretary of State,
Yeah.
and fill those offices with their appointees who will correct the failure. And so I don't know that that's going to happen, but boy, the tactic, and it sure looks similar, and the language is very much like what was used at the beginning of the millennium when Scott Walker was a governor in Wisconsin. And so I just am looking at this and thinking, well, what if you'd sort of declare a state a failed state?
Well,
And
and
what does that mean about an election coming up for us in the fall for the representatives of that state to a national government. Can you say that those are illegal elections? I mean, I don't know where this goes.
Well, and we have to note all of this rhetoric is so rooted in lies and distortions. Minnesota has one of the smallest immigrant populations in the entire country. We are still an overwhelmingly white state. If you're really looking to go after immigrants, you would not come to Minnesota, which is one of the furthest places from the US-Mexico border. I think it's also relevant that so Minnesota, I think right now it represents, for me personally, I think for our country, it represents both a story of hope and a story of warning, as Diana points out. And the hopeful piece and the warning piece you can see in that we have these partnerships between two white men, Jacob Frey, mayor of Minneapolis, who I did not vote for, but who nonetheless represents us, and Tim Walz, our governor. So two white men. And then we have two very powerful uh, non-white leaders in Keith Ellison, our state attorney general, who has brought countless suits against the Trump administration, including a suit asking to stop the ICE activity, and my Congresswoman, Ilhan Omar, both of whom have been relentlessly attacked. And then we also have white women in the Senate, Tina Smith and Amy Klobuchar. So you have these strong partnerships of people working together, trusting each other across racial, across religious lines. This is an example of how America could look and how things can work. And I think that's one of the reasons that the Trump administration wants to destroy it so much. But when we're talking about the upper Midwest, I also want to look at the story really of the Dakotas. The Dakotas remain a hotbed of ELCA Lutheranism. We still have majority folks who attend our churches when it comes to Protestant denominations in those states. And I've been invited multiple times to give presentations on Christian nationalism in those states. It was not that long ago that we had prominent senatorial leadership and representation of Democrats from the Dakotas. But as Diana points out, much in the same way as this happened in Wisconsin, it also happened on a smaller scale in the Dakotas, to where now Democrats in South Dakota say we can hold our party convention in a minivan. So the systematic destruction of local bonds, the systematic abandoning in some cases of red state Democrats by the National Party, I think has contributed to this situation. I also went to college in Missouri. My husband's from Missouri. Missouri used to be a swing state. And so I think it's important to hold in tension the warning story and also the hope story of, because I'm continuing every single day. I got a message from Grand Forks today asking me to come and talk to their people about Christian nationalism because people are concerned about what's happening with ICE. I think we can't ignore sort of the stirrings of democracy, the stirrings of resistance, the stirrings of regret in some of these places that, so it's a very much, I swing from hopefulness to utter despair all the time.
And on the theme of hope, can we talk just a little bit about the people showing up in the communities? I mean, the little silver lining of hope on the horror that, we're living through is seeing just ordinary people just realize what's happening and then deciding, no, I'm going to go out in the streets. It's not a pleasant time to be out on the streets in Minneapolis this time of year, right? Generally speaking, it's dangerous. And what I found so inspiring was, the day after the Renee Good shooting, 1,000 people showed up in that neighborhood to get trained to do exactly what she was doing. Right? That is the spirit of resistance that we don't know, or like on the one hand, we don't know how far things are going to go from the Trump administration, although history is, so far it's following pretty textbook. So we can kind of plot things out, and we haven't been wrong yet, just maybe the order of things and the speed of things. But we also don't know what kind of resistance we're going to see, what that spark is going to be. And I'm also seeing story after story of people who are not kind of the usual suspects, who aren't, who haven't been out there raising the alarm, who haven't been even, posting on social media and certainly not attending any kind of political organizing event, those are the people who by the hundreds and thousands are showing up right now in Minneapolis. And so I find that immensely inspiring, also frightening because I know they're, putting their lives on the line potentially. And so I just have utmost admiration for every single one of them, wherever they're coming from, whatever party they belong to, whatever they have said or haven't said in the past, that they are now showing up, as you said, in solidarity. So shout out to all of the Minnesotans who are showing up these days.
Well,
Angela, I
Kristen,
just have a
oh,
quick
yeah,
question.
yeah.
It sort of feeds a little bit into what Kristen was asking. We went right over the lieutenant governor's office when we were talking about all the incredible people in state leadership in Minnesota. Can you say something about her?
I can say a lot about Peggy Flanagan, and our future senator. She's running for Senate this fall.
Oh, wow.
Um, so she comes from a Native background. She lives not far from here. She presents herself also as a mom, and I think that we're seeing parents. I mean, I keep returning to the New Republic recently published a story about the Cassandras, which all of us may fall into that category of people who saw the impending damage from Trump early and have continued to cite the alarms. And the article mentioned how many of these folks were parents. And there's this instinct as a parent that you'll run into traffic for your kids, right? And I think that is the instinct that is driving so many Minnesotans into the street because we're afraid for our kids. We want our, my kids were off school last Thursday and Friday because it was not safe for them to attend school in Minneapolis because of the incursion of the federal government. St. Paul Public Schools are going to be off 2 days next week. Our local Catholic school, Annunciation Catholic School, which suffered a school shooting, these kids have lived through a school shooting. They were off school last week because of the unpredictability and lack of safety from ICE agents. Yes, we have inspiring, brave people. And I think when Kristen talks about the hope, and Kristen, there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing, right?
Of course,
Um,
of course.
you
Still
know,
have my coat from when I lived there. I've never worn it again since, but I was never cold when I had that coat on.
that's right. That's right. So I think all of us in Minnesota, we're glad to see these cold temperatures coming this weekend. It's going to be dangerously cold and we welcome it. We're looking forward to it. But I think that real bravery gives lie to the false bravado that so many of these theobros that we've been covering, so many of these guys who have laid the groundwork for ICE agents, for Pete Hegseth, for JD Vance. For me, as someone who spent a lot of time around professional athletes, there's just such a distinction between real strength, real bravery. And I think what people are seeing in ordinary Minnesotans who are putting their lives on the line, a friend of mine, he was coaching basketball, youth basketball the other night, and he said, I'm having trouble coaching tonight. I can't see that well because I was tear gassed earlier today. This is a guy also who grew up evangelical, who grew up rooted in these teachings and has turned away from it. So I think that contrast between the real bravery of ordinary Minnesotans, whether we're carrying shovels, whether we are getting out there with our phones and videotaping, facing up to assault rifles and flash bombs. A story out of Minnesota reported by our local news today is that last night in the wake of the shooting, there was a man who was driving a van with 6 children in it, one of them a 6-month-old child. One of the flashbangs thrown by ICE agents hit his van. All 6 children were hospitalized, including the 6-month-old who briefly lost consciousness. The real bravery of the first responders who came in to revive that child, the real bravery of people standing and putting their bodies in the way, in the midst of picking our kids up from school, in the midst of doing our jobs because we have to keep working, in the midst of grocery shopping. I think that is going to perform a real contrast against these guys who are cosplaying some sort of military invasion in residential neighborhoods. It's absolutely ridiculous that they're coming in here with SWAT gear against mothers taking their kids to school. It's absolutely ridiculous and they look like fools.
Real bravery gives lie to the false bravado. Amen, Angela. That was so well said.
I think one of my favorite stories was a story about ICE showing up on someone's porch and the guy chased him off with a snow shovel. And I thought that's like one of the most Minnesota stories I've ever heard. They're messing with something they don't really understand. Is that incredible, honestly, Nordic toughness. Uh, and all day I've been thinking about the words of a mighty fortress is our God. And that song, is sort of almost like the Lutheran national anthem. And usually it's sung from a position of privilege on All Saints' Day or what have you. But when I got to the verse and I was reading about the Prince of Darkness grim, we tremble not for him. And it was like, whoa, this was not intended to be a hymn of privilege. This was a hymn that was written from the underside when Martin Luther was actually on the run from the imperial strength of the medieval church. And it's a song about victims standing up for real truth against power, the power of princes, and of course the devil too, and which princes often manifest the power of the devil. So I would just keep thinking about that and how those sorts of really deep ancient chords of memory are present in so much of the culture of white folks in Minnesota. Um, that's an impressive cultural heritage, and it's one that I think that I'm seeing pulled on from a distance. I have lots of friends and relatives up there, and so I'm certainly seeing it embodied in those people.
Yeah, Diana's reminding me of yeah, I think we forget and we are all from the Protestant tradition here. So with apologies to our Catholic listeners, let me just kind of indulge a little Protestantism here. But when I've been speaking at Protestant churches lately, I've been saying like we have all got to remember like the word Protestant, we've forgotten what that means. Like we just kind of say it like it's, just some ordinary word, but it literally has the word protest in it. That's what it means, right? And we forget that like, for the Lutherans, Martin Luther, for the Presbyterians, John Knox, all of these people were exiled. They were political enemies of the state for their religious views, right? Many of them had to run for their lives, and many of them lost their lives for standing up for it. So, Angela, I've got a question for you as a pastor, and this is maybe an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think we're up for it?
Hmm.
And do you think pastors, particularly white pastors, who've had a very comfy existence, and who went into seminary, you know, not necessarily thinking that being called on to become an enemy of the state was on their bingo card. Like, are we up for it?
I think I think women clergy are leading the way. I really do. Um, what I notice, and I get asked about this often, about the discrimination that I've faced as a woman and as a pastor and understanding that identity. And it's been a difficult road. Yeah, I was mistaken more than once for my colleague's wife, even though he was 30 years older than me when I served in California, because that's the only way people could conceive of a woman pastor. But what I noticed when I come to these protest events in Minneapolis, um, among Christian clergy outside of our Catholic priest participants, it's so often women. And so I think that there is this bravery among small church and rural women pastors. And I'm not discounting the bravery and support because there are men who are standing there shoulder to shoulder as well. But I think there is a grit and a willingness to suffer among women pastors. We entered into this vocation, most of us knowing that we were not the ideal clergy for many Christians, and we would face doubt. We would face lack of respect, we would face people not wanting to listen to us. And so I appreciate the leadership of women clergy, and I certainly think the same goes to say for our LGBTQ clergy. Certainly the same goes to say for non-white clergy. In my sphere, where I'm seeing it primarily is among women, and I appreciate that solidarity and that working together and leadership that I'm seeing by so many women clergy.
I'll say a couple of days ago, a bishop in New Hampshire, Episcopal bishop, garnered some attention online after a recording of a speech that he gave kind of went viral in the wake of the Minneapolis shooting. So this is Bishop Rob Hirschfeld, and he advised clergy to get their wills ready and their things in order so that they can do their jobs in this moment, right? And I have to say, kind of the theme of the whole conversation, the theme of our existence these days is horror and inspiration, right? Horror and hope. And there was something, of course, chilling that this is where we are at, and then also deeply inspiring to see, in this case, a member of the clergy call on others to say, this is what you have trained for, right? This
Take up
is
your
who you
cross.
are. Yep, take up your cross. This is your job, right? This is who we are. This is what we do. And I have to say, progressive clergy, progressive Christians generally, the mainline, they've often not really been known for, I don't know, inspiring the masses in recent, say, decades, or at least that's kind of, the storyline out there. And I've been impressed by seeing many really rise to this moment. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the bravery or the power of their witness. I know Jack Jenkins, a reporter at RNS, Religion News Service, has really been doing excellent work kind of covering this beat. I know he was on the ground in Minneapolis this week as well. And bringing to our attention the people who are showing up, the ordinary citizens and the pastors, the faith leaders who thus far have really been present and at the center of things.
It's really worth noting that Bishop Hirschfield and the Diocese of New Hampshire, that's the diocese that elected Gene Robinson over and against the advice of rest of global Anglicanism. They went for the person they felt was called to be their bishop, even though that person was a gay man. And so they were willing to defy literally their world to do what they believed was right. And the reason I point that out is also the same reason I wanted to point out the thing about the Lutheran hymn is that a lot of people who are from these different traditions that are by and large white have ancestral DNA of doing justice. And sometimes we haven't paid as much attention to that part of identity in these communities. And right now, that this to me seems like it's one of the times we pull on that alternative route. So often it's been the taproot of racism that has shaped us. There's also the taproot of rebellion, of truth, of protest, of standing up for victims. That's also been part of the stories of the Lutherans in Minnesota, the Episcopalians in New Hampshire. And you can just kind of go through American history and you can find these sorts of communities. And those communities are communities that we have admired and seen as heroic for many, many, many decades. And for those of us who are white, it's our turn to live into that part of who we are.
Well, thanks, Diana. Thanks, Angela. Thanks, Kristen, for being here. So this has been the Convocation Unscripted. You can find us here every week. And you could also sign up at the Convocation Unscripted on Substack. So on behalf of Kristen Dumais, Jamar Tisby, who's not with us today, Diana Butler Bass, and our guest, the Reverend Angela Denker, author of the book Disciples of White Jesus. What is it? Is that right?
That's right.
Disciples of White Jesus, yes. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing and helping us both acknowledge the horror and hold out the hope.